Brewster here, and on the Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is the MXR Fuzz Pedal Freq-Out. And fuzz distortion is very popular with guitarists and has been since the early, to mid-60s when it was introduced. And legends of the guitar, Hendrix and Clapton and Jeff Beck, and more recent, heroes, Eric Johnson, Scott Holliday, Jack White. There's tons of players that use fuzz. And it's a really interesting and often misunderstood, effect. And this lesson is going to basically attack fuzz and fuzz pedals and kind of clear the air. So here we go. So a lot of things in music seem to occur in cycles, and it seems like every 5 to 10 years there's a big fuzz, comeback or a resurgence, just like phase and wah and talkbox and some other classic, effects. But in recent years, fuzz has just exploded, and there's so many different brands and makes and modifications for this, really common pedal and effect. But it's kind of overwhelming to notice like all of the options out there. So I'm a big MXR fan. I also like Xotic and TC Electronic. You might like or prefer, a different brand, but I definitely recommend, try some different fuzz pedals just to see what they can do and kind of get an earful of the sound and tone that these different pedals have. Honestly, if you're looking for that vintage, 60s fuzz sound, you might want to actually pick, a vintage, pedal, or at least a modern version of a vintage pedal. And that includes, of course, the tone bender, the Maestro fuzz tone, the fuzz face, the big muff. Those are classic fuzz pedals for sure. And then to help you understand like the difference between your clean tone and like a slight overdrive or slight distortion tone and then fuzz, the best way to actually, notice it or understand it, aside from hearing it, is actually seeing it. And if we look at the waveforms, the actual sound wave of these different effects, you can kind of see the difference between clean, dirty, and fuzz. The main thing that separates different fuzz pedals and fuzz tones are the transistors that are actually in the pedal that you're using. And you have two different types with fuzz. You have germanium and silicon. And germanium kind of has that warmer, round, kind of vintage, 60s sound. And silicon's more, harsh and distorted. It definitely has more of a modern kind of flavor. But it's important to realize like what, transistors in the pedal you're checking out, because it's noticeably going to have a very different sound with the different transistor. To give you an even better idea of fuzz, what it sounds like, where you can find it, and these different shades or colors of fuzz guitar. And here's an image with a bunch of famous songs that feature, fuzz effects. Whether it's the whole song, it could be the guitar solo, maybe just a lick or something in the song. But here's some, very familiar and famous songs that feature fuzz. This episode is going to feature the 3 fuzz pedals I have in my stash, and they all happen to be MXR, and they're right here on this board. There's also a tuner over here, which we're not really going to use that, and there's a Spark mini booster from TC Electronic, and that's not even turned on. I'm not really sure why that's hanging out. I just left it there on my board. But I'm going to walk through all three of these pedals and kind of demo each so you can hear it and kind of tweak out, some of the settings and kind of freak them out. And, kind of give you some tone tips and just some suggestions, to get better sounds using fuzz and to get the most out of your fuzz pedals. First up is the Band of Gypsys fuzz, and this is the wildest, craziest fuzz pedal I own. This thing is a monster, and you really have to watch your settings. So I don't know if you can see this, but the EQ is set kind of like at 3 o'clock, and then the volume and the fuzz are both over at 9 o'clock. So normally with a fuzz pedal, you want to turn the output up. You don't want to run a fuzz pedal like you would, say, a slight overdrive kind of thing. You want to turn it up. You want to hear the fuzz. But with this one, I turn them, it's almost like the exact opposite of these two, because the volume and the fuzz are almost off. It's up to 9 o'clock. And you'll see on these two pedals, I have the output and fuzz, turned up a lot. But anyway, here's my starting tone. Kick this fuzz on, you're really going to be able to tell. So that's at a minimal setting, and if I start turning this fuzz up, it gets crazy. Turn that fuzz up and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to turn it all the way up and it just gets this crazy, like woolly mammoth kind of sound. Lots of feedback and sustain. And sometimes it's kind of fun just to, max out a fuzz pedal and then just start shredding. To play because there's so much distortion and it's just all tweaked out and fuzzed out. Really cool, but I mean that's really not that usable or realistic. So I usually turn it back like Here's a tone tip using fuzz, but you can also apply this to distortion and overdrive too, and that's using noise or listening to the noise that the effect or pedal produces, and then kind of shaping your EQ or the settings to kind of reduce that noise. And I'm going to use the Band of Gypsys fuzz just as an example. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn everything up. I'm not going to play anything, but you hear all that noise? Okay, so that's everything maxed. And it sounds like a weird air conditioner or something. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my ear and I'm going to start turning that down. I just reduced the fuzz and it almost went away. Now I'm changing that EQ and I'm also going to roll back that volume. And the noise magically disappears, but I still have fuzz. But it sounds more musical, it's definitely more realistic or usable, in a real world situation, because you don't have all this crazy, all that crazy noise. So you don't want that in your tone. Obviously, if that's how you set your pedal, it's going to sound ugly and noisy and awful. But if you start to, listen for that noise and reduce it, the next thing you know, you're going to have actually a really good tone. Next next up is the classic 108 Mini Fuzz, and this is a very cool pedal. Very usable and dynamic and musical and realistic too. And no offense to the two Hendrix pedals, but these two create very specific Hendrixisms, which is really cool. But there's only certain times or places that you may actually be able to use those sounds or tones. But with the 108 Classic Mini pedal, it's very transparent. It's not quite as crazy as the band of Gypsys Fuzz, but you can also kind of almost hide the fact you're using fuzz. So let me show you what I mean. So here's my starting tone. And then here's the fuzz. And one thing I like to do actually is turn the fuzz all the way down and turn the output up. So here's my starting tone. And then here's the fuzz. Very, very mild fuzz. You can't really even hear it. And then, max it out, you can definitely get that really screaming crazy, amount of fuzz. And if we turn that buffer off, it definitely gets kind of wild. Last but not least is the Octavio Fuzz, and this is a very interesting pedal, even though it's really just kind of a one-trick pony or maybe a two-trick pony. But I really just wanted that Octavio effect, and of course it has the groovy artwork and stuff, and it's the Hendrix version. But first I'm going to demonstrate the fuzz, which the fuzz on this pedal, just the straight fuzz effect, is kind of underwhelming. It's not really that great. But here's my starting tone. And then here's just the fuzz. So it's not bad. Let me turn the fuzz down a little bit. The meat and potatoes, or I guess the main attraction here, is that Octavio effect, which there's a button to engage that. And really it's just creating this kind of sub-octave, kind of weird, almost like a blue box kind of, this harmonized, kind of erratic, sound. And it's interesting, it really jumps out if you're using, your neck pickup and you start to play somewhere above the 12th fret. And you can still hear it on the lower frets, but it really jumps in those higher, areas like this. That helps with this Octavio effect is it is pretty wild, and definitely very rough and raw and kind of hairy around the edges. But when you hear that sound, one thing you can do with any fuzz pedal, but especially the Octavio, is you want to manipulate and turn down the volume on your guitar, and that kind of tames that crazy beast like this. And maybe you want that kind of lower, not quite as crazy effect. Like that, which is, it has this weird, erratic, kind of spazzy sound. Which definitely sounds like a blue box, big time. And it starts squawking and kind of freaking out a little bit too. And then as you raise that volume control, it starts to get obviously louder, but it also changes the character of the effect. And you can kind of create those really quiet, weird, kind of freaked out moments too. Really cool. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Brewster's Millions of Rants with the MXR Fuzz Pedal Freq-Out. And definitely fuzz is an interesting effect, or, tone. And there's just something about it, like when you kick it on, you might actually start playing a little bit differently, or you might kind of have access, to some classic songs that have these fuzzed out and freaked out, guitar tones. People like Eddie Hazel, of course, Jimi Hendrix. But there's all these, really interesting sounds and textures and tones that you can get, if you start playing around with fuzz. So I would recommend, picking one up, regardless of what brand it is, and then just sit there and really tweak the tone. And the interesting thing is there's all these little in-between, things that you might run into. So fuzz really is one of those pedals where you want to just barely turn a knob and then check out the difference, and then barely turn a knob and then check it again. Because, when you start to move one knob, it kind of influences the other settings, and the tone overall, which is really cool and inspiring too. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it, more content and material. Thank you.